Hello and welcome to today's talk on how the microbes in our gut or belly affects our brain and our nervous system and how we feel. And my name is Bronwyn Satch, and I've been practicing as a naturopath for about 15 years, and a big part of this time has been focused on mental health. So I use a number of tools to support a healthy mental state. So the physical and biological support is through herbal and nutritional medicine, including the microbes in the gut. And I like to use mindfulness and communication to support our mental, emotional, and relational health. So this is the big picture of what I do. And today I'd like to really look at one piece of that, which is the microbes in the gut, and how the microbiome really impacts our mental health and how we feel. So let's look at this thing called the microbiome. So what are we talking about? What am I talking about? So the microbiome is a term used to describe the almost 2 kilograms of microbes in our gut. So within our gut, which if you touch your belly, like the lower abdomen, this is where the microbiome lives. And I like to think of it as a rainforest. So it's like, if you can imagine a rainforest, a very diverse ecology. There's lots of different microbes, lots of different creatures that make up the microbiome. And in a healthy microbiome, in a fully grown adult, it's about 2 kilos. So it's quite a size, and it is classed as an organ now. So the scientists and researchers are recognizing that it is an important organ, like your heart, your liver, your lungs. And the microbiome, the microbes can be found throughout the body. So we're actually inhabited all over. We're inhabited by microbes. However, the majority of microbes are found in the colon. So that's the lower part of the digestive tract. And yeah, each region, so we've got a microbiome in the mouth, the skin has its own microbiome, the stomach, the upper digestive system, the small intestines, and the colon. So they all have their own unique microbiome that all help that organ to function properly. I think it's important when looking at the microbiome just to know how it begins, like how we get this microbiome, because we are mostly sterile in the womb. So in our mother's belly, so in the mother's womb, we're mostly sterile. And as we come through the birth canal, this is when we get inoculated with microbes. So our microbiome, it is greatly influenced by our mother's health, so how mum was when she was pregnant with you, and her ecology, so how her microbes were, and your dad's microbiome has an impact on your microbiome. And then the diet, so what we feed ourselves, so when we put food into our digestive tract, into our mouth, that is actually our food. It's also the microbes' food. That's what we're feeding our microbes. So our diet has a big impact on our microbiome. And the medication, so the microbes are very sensitive to chemicals, particularly medications, and also chemicals in the diet, in our environment. So our environment will really impact our microbiome. And just things like at birth, so research has shown that a vaginal birth, or a natural sort of birth through the birth canal, leads to different microbes than a C-section or a cesarean. So the vaginal births lead to greater populations of lactobacillus species, one particular species, while the C-section leads to greater populations of skin microbes like Staphylococcus species. So there's really clear differences between if you're born vaginally or C-section. So these sorts of things, this really influences how your microbiome establishes. And then following birth, so it's particularly the first few months, depending on who you spend time with and what you're exposed to, this will influence the development of the microbiome. There are differences between children or babies that grow up in the country and on farms and have animals around and dirt compared to city, more sterile living. So there are clear differences as well. And stress plays a part in shaping and influencing our microbiome. So the hormones of stress will influence and change our microbiome, not for the better. And genetics, genetics also plays a role. There's a very interactive relationship between our microbes and our genes. And we won't spend too much time on this, but it's worth knowing that this also influences our microbiome. So the microbiome is so important. I just want to cover this before we sort of segue into how it's important for our nervous system and how we feel. But in general, it's one of your most metabolically active organs. So it's an organ that really, it's very active. So there's a lot happening in the microbiome, and there's lots of interaction between the microbes and between our human body. So it looks after the digestive system. So just by inhabiting, so it lives in the digestive system, so in the gut wall, so the lining of the digestive system. By looking after its own environment, like it's not trying to do us a favor, it's just by looking after its own environment, it also looks after us. So it looks after our gut wall. It helps the microbes help to look after us, so they protect us. So the beneficial microbes help protect us against pathogenic microbes just by crowding them out. So just by having a diverse range of microbes, and particularly there's quite a few beneficial microbes, but even if you have some of the bad guys, just by having a diverse range of microbes, they help just crowd out, they keep each other in check. So there's a balance and they keep each other in check, and so that one organism doesn't become predominant, hopefully. They also help us digest food. And again, it's because they are consuming the food that we're eating that they help us to digest our food. They're in communication with our human cells, including our DNA. So there's an interaction. There's always, there's a constant interaction between our cells, the human cells, and the microbes. And there's a really strong link, particularly with our immune system. The immune system is in direct communication with the microbes. Our microbes help us detoxify, and again, by keeping their environment clean, they also look after our environment. And they produce substances, so they eat the food that we provide, and then it's their excrement, so their wee and poo basically, that are metabolites. We call them metabolites. The proper name is metabolites. And they produce B vitamins and vitamin K, for example. There's others, but they do produce B vitamins and vitamin K, which are really beneficial for us. And they also, so they produce some metabolites which really help us and support us, particularly our brain, and we'll get into that in a moment. And they also, some produce metabolites that can harm us or damage, particularly our brain and nervous system. And there's a really strong connection with the gut and the brain, even though the distance, there's quite a bit of distance between your belly and your brain. There's some strong connections which we'll go into as well. And that's via the vagus nerve. Excuse me. So let's look a little bit closer at how the microbiome, how your microbiome, how my microbiome influences our mood. So it's well recognized now that mental health problems, which used to be seen as very much a brain and psychological problem, it's now seen as a whole body condition. So it is, or there's also a physical component to it. It's not just psychological or genetic. That there's that as well. So it's a mixture. There's not just one thing happening. There's usually a psychological situation, genetic. There's genetics involved, and we now know that there is physical involvement as well. So our physical body affects how we feel and our mood. So one example of how the microbes influence how we feel. There's in the gut, some of the byproducts or the metabolites that the microbes produce are neurotransmitters. So things like sunny serotonin that just helps us feel happy. It's the feel good and makes us feel normal, even normal, and allows us to be happy when the psychological conditions are right. Dopamine that gives us the get up and go. GABA, which is calming and regulating. And noradrenaline, which also gives us a boost of energy and inspiration. They also produce B vitamins in their active form too. It not like taking a supplement, and they're produced in tiny amounts but constantly. So there's this constant small amount of B vitamins coming in from the gut for the brain and the rest of the body, but we'll focus on the brain. And this is just how the brain likes it, just likes a little tiny but constant supply of B vitamins. So it's a really convenient situation, if you like, to have these microbes in the gut producing these B vitamins for us. They also produce short-chain fatty acids, and there's a couple of them, but the one that we'll focus on is called butyrate. And this is very beneficial, particularly when we're talking of brain health, mental health. They also produce a very toxic substance called LPS for short, or lipopolysaccharides. And we will go into this a lot more detail, but this is damaging and inflammatory for the brain. And really, you'll see as we go into this in more detail, you see this is not a great thing to have. And alcohol, there's a lot of microbes that produce alcohol and acetaldehyde, which are known brain toxins. They damage and influence and hinder brain function, make us feel yucky. So there's a lot of metabolites. These are just a few. The microbes produce a whole host of metabolites. This is just a few that are more specific to our mental health. So let's look at this substance. This is one that's really worth taking note of. Lipopolysaccharide, so it's a substance produced, well, it's not even produced in the gut, it's part of certain microbes, so the proteobacteria and the Bacteroidetes phylum. So that's a umbrella term for a whole host of microbes. It's part of their body. So as they just metabolize and as they live and die, there's a lot of lipopolysaccharide sort of free and available in the gut if you have certain microbes. And this really interferes with the production of serotonin. So I think you probably, if you hear on this talk, you probably know that serotonin is a good thing. So anything that interferes with serotonin is not going to be great for mental health. And one of the ways it does that is that it's highly inflammatory, particularly in the brain. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it can really cause inflammation in the brain. So there have actually been studies done where they have injected humans and rodents, unfortunately, when they're injected with LPS, it brings about depressive symptoms. So you can actually induce depression by injecting LPS. And there's some studies that have shown the link between LPS and suicide, even if there's suicide ideation and suicide attempts, that these people may have a stronger reaction to LPS. There may not be more, there may be more, but their body or their immune system is reacting stronger to LPS, and so they feel worse. So that it makes them feel even worse. Another thing that LPS does, which is really damaging for mental health, is it causes the gut wall, which is the digestive system wall, to become more permeable. So that we'll go into that a little bit more as well. That's quite an important area when talking about mental health. And just as a side, not directly related to mental health, but can contribute, is that it leads to insulin resistance, which promotes obesity. So it's harder to manage weight when your body is insulin resistant, and LPS contributes to insulin resistance as well. I just want to look a bit closer at this thing called leaky gut syndrome. The technical, the more official term is permeable gut syndrome, but we'll go with leaky gut. It's a bit easier to roll off the tongue. So basically, as you can see in the diagram, the barrier, there is a barrier in the gut. So the gut wall is the barrier to substances coming into the bloodstream. So it sort of filters out what shouldn't be getting into the bloodstream. So the digestive system, so the small intestine is where food is digested and absorbed. And the lining, so it's like a really fine sieve. If you can imagine a fine sieve, which only allows the broken down products of digestion to pass through it into the bloodstream. So what's coming through is actually going into our bloodstream. It's the sort of the gateway between what we eat and how it gets into the bloodstream. And it normally keeps undigested food molecules and bacteria and yeasts and toxins out of the bloodstream. They shouldn't be in the bloodstream. Only certain things should be getting through into the bloodstream. And when the lining of the gut is compromised, this fine sieve, when it should be a fine sieve, becomes more of a colander, sort of that wider gaps, and it allows undigested particles and toxins and bacteria and yeast to actually get into the body. So it's like having, sounds really awful, but it's like basically like poo getting into the bloodstream. So the waste that's meant to be expelled and kept in the digestive system is actually absorbed into the bloodstream. And this puts the immune system on red alert, like there's substances coming in that just should not be coming into the bloodstream. And unfortunately, usually along with a leaky gut, so if you've got leaky gut, it's hyperpermeable, it's highly likely that the blood-brain barrier is also leaky. So this is another barrier that keeps certain substances out of the brain and helps to keep the brain healthy. So how does all this, what goes wrong? What's actually going wrong here? So there's, it's worth looking at what's going wrong so that then we can obviously help correct it, try and help correct it. So one of the main umbrella terms, if you like, that is used is the term dysbiosis. So dysbiosis just means simply that there's an imbalance of microbes. So there's not enough beneficial bacteria and too many pathogenic bacteria, or the microbes in the gut, even if you've got beneficial bacteria, the microbes are not getting the proper food so they can produce the beneficial metabolites. So remember we said that the food that you eat is also the food that you're feeding the microbes. So you may have beneficial microbes, but if you're not feeding them the proper food, they will still be producing toxic metabolites. And how do we get dysbiosis? So what's happening to promote the imbalance of microbes? What usually happens from birth, when look back through people's history, usually there is probably an imbalance from birth. Either mum or dad's microbiome is compromised, and it's generational. So each generation is getting weaker and weaker and more dysbiotic. And that's partly because our Western living is not supportive of our microbes, but particularly the Western diet favors some of the bad bugs. Medication, so any chemical passing through the digestive system is going to impact the microbes, but particularly antibiotics, proton pump inhibitors, which are to help with acid reflux, and the oral contraceptive pill. These are examples of specific medications that have been shown to specifically damage or change the microbiome. Also stress, we talked briefly about stress, but the hormonal response of the body to stress also favors some of the bad bugs. Like it will feed up, they actually feed on cortisol. So long-term, and we're not talking about sort of a one-off, we're meant to get stressed and we're meant to recover from stress. That's not the issue. It's the long-term chronic stress that we don't have any relief from. That's the damaging stress that will damage the microbiome. And even the pesticides, so modern food production, which relies heavily on pesticides in order to produce the quantity of foods that we need, monoculture food, it also, as we said, any chemicals that pass through the digestive system will impact the microbiome. And even chlorine in water. So our tap water has chlorine, which it's there to actually kill bacteria. That's what it's meant to do. It's meant to kill bacteria. So of course that's what's happening in the gut as well, particularly some of the more fragile bacteria. And just living in our modern world, we're much less exposed to microbes. So in traditional cultures, they lived more in nature and they were exposed to a lot more microbes. We don't get the exposure that we're used to, particularly as children. This really influences the microbiome and how the immune system and the microbiome interact as well. There's quite a strong correlation between how the immune system develops and living too cleanly. And there was a large study, there's probably been a couple now, but there was a large study in 2015 showing that the more antibiotics you have, the greater your risk of depression. There was a clear correlation, and the researchers pointed out that it was highly likely due to the effect of the microbiome, but there's probably more studies to show how that is the case. So what is this? So when you have dysbiosis or the imbalance of microbes, how does that actually affect the brain? Well, there's a few different ways this happens. So without enough of the beneficial microbes or not enough of the metabolites, so if they're not being fed well either, there's not enough neurotransmitters produced. So about 80% of serotonin is produced in the gut. Now that doesn't mean that all of that serotonin is meant for the brain. There's a lot that's needed in the gut as well, but it is a big factor. The brain is inflamed. So this means that the brain, it doesn't work well. It's simplistic. So if you can imagine, so if you think of inflamed skin, it's a bit easier to imagine. So when you have inflamed skin, your skin is tender, it's puffy, so it's a little bit swollen, it can be red and sore. So inflammation in the brain, the cells, they just don't work effectively. The neurotransmitters, it's a lock and key situation. The neurotransmitters don't work well. The production of neurotransmitters is hindered. So that substance we talked about, LPS, that really interferes with the steps of producing serotonin. So there's a few steps to go from tryptophan, or the food, from what we eat, to making serotonin. And some of those steps can be interfered with by LPS. So that lipopolysaccharide just if you like, pushes serotonin, pushes the tryptophan into a different pathway that it's called the kyuranine pathway, and produces toxins rather than serotonin. So there's a very clear correlation between LPS and the neurotransmitter serotonin and others as well. So the brain is starved of B vitamins. This in itself is quite a big thing. The brain can't function at optimum. It can't even function normally, let alone at optimum. So without a good supply of B vitamins, activated B vitamins, the brain just won't be functioning as well at all. Your immune system is overactive. This in real terms just means you feel really horrid and unwell. It's like a brain flu. If your immune system's activated, your brain's inflamed, you just feel foggy, and the brain doesn't process as well. It can't actually process, and you just feel really horrid. And there's more toxins and heavy metals getting in because the beneficial bacteria in the gut protect us against toxins and heavy metals. Then if you don't have that protection, then you'll be more exposed to things like mercury and lead. And there was a really good study highlighting this to do with mercury. And they had two groups of rats, and one of the groups they completely sterilized by heavy duty antibiotics, so broad spectrum antibiotics, to wipe out the microbiome. So they were mostly sterile. The other group they left intact. They fed them both the same food and the same amount of mercury in their food. So they each had a dose of mercury with their food, and they were able to see how much mercury was absorbed into the bloodstream. And the rats that had the sterile gut, so no microbiome or very little microbiome, they absorbed about 90% of the mercury from their food, like a really large percentage of the mercury was absorbed, whereas the rats with their microbiome intact, they only absorbed less than 10%. I can't remember how much. There was a very small percentage was absorbed. So there's a big influence on our ability to handle things like mercury and lead with having a good microbiome. And leaky gut, coming back to leaky gut, that really influences how we feel. So basically, it's like we're having waste is getting into our bloodstream that just should not be there, and that again is contributing to inflammation, just making us feel pretty horrid. And that has systemic effects too, not just in the brain. That's quite a big one. And we probably all have this to some degree, like there will be varying degrees, but I've found, and other people have found, that particularly in depression and anxiety, this can be a big thing. And then, leaky blood-brain barrier, which means that the brain's not as protected as it should be. So I painted a pretty bad picture, hey? But what can we do? So there's plenty we can do. And the main thing you can probably gather from all of this is to support good microbes, and also support the microbes you have with a good diet. So having an anti-inflammatory, fiber-rich diet full of nutrients, and using herbs as well to support your digestive system and brain health. And supporting good microbes with prebiotics and probiotics. So just very briefly, this is a whole subject within itself, but prebiotics are specific food or fertilizer for the good bugs. So prebiotics feed the microbes, and the probiotics, they are supplemental microbes. So they're actually microbes that have been isolated and are stable. They're able to be encapsulated or put into powder, and you can then take them and you can have some of the benefits of the microbes. They may not colonize, they may just be transient, they may just pass through, but they can still have beneficial effects and influence our microbiome. There's some of the very specific things that you can do to really support your microbes to get them to help you feel good is I like to think of the microbes like a pet. So it's like you've got an extra pet or an extra little creature to look after. So they need good food, like good quality food. They need watering and exercise and socialization. They do actually need to be interacting with other microbes. So getting out into nature, getting dirty, mixing with people, all helps to diversify your microbiome. And that's one of the markers of good health, if you like, is diversity. So regardless of what microbes you have, diversity is a real key in staying healthy, your microbiome, keeping you healthy. Microbes love fiber. So we need to avoid any chemicals, but avoiding chlorinated water is particularly important because that's you drinking that daily. Like that's a constant insult to the microbes. Eating plenty and variety of fibers from preferably organic fruits and vegetables. Good rule of thumb is to have one raw salad a day. It's a good thing to aim for if you're not doing that already. Exercise has been specifically shown to improve diversity, particularly of the microbiome. We're not sure why, the researchers couldn't say why, but it is shown that a good half hour to an hour, at least every second day, an exercise which gets you sweating. You need to get a sweat up and get the heart rate up. And this stimulates your immune system, and that may be one of the reasons why it helps the microbiome. Getting out into nature, just getting dirty, getting and getting to the beach, different things like just getting out there, getting into nature. Organic gardening is supposed to be very good for supporting microbiome. And avoiding strong chemical cleaners and disinfectants. Just watch yourself if you are using chemical cleaners and disinfectants. Be very respectful with them because you're breathing and may possibly they're actually in contact with the skin. I think that will have a damaging effect as well on the microbiome. And managing stress. So just making sure you've got some good strategies to help manage stress as well that will support your microbiome. And this is probably very controversial, but just avoiding antibiotics or using them really respectfully, because unless your life is in danger or there's risk of permanent damage, then you go herbal. There's some excellent herbal remedies to help support your immune system that are anti-infective and can be used as well. And avoiding and leaving antibiotics until you really, really need them. Then at least we won't be building up as much resistance either. They're probably more effective if you wait until you really, really need them, not just using them at the first sign of anything happening. And support your immune system, support a fever. Your fever, the fever will help reduce any viral and bacterial load and support your immune system. And again, that's a whole talk for another time. So where from here, another a way to help support your microbiome is to actually test it and see what you've got. What is your individual microbiome? And it is very individual. Yours will be like no others. It's like a fingerprint. And the company I use, Microba, they test for about 2,000. Oh, it's more now. There's a huge amount of microbes that they test for. So each person has about 160 to 200 microbes, and we can look at how they're balanced and what microbes are there and which ones are predominant and what metabolites you're likely to be producing. That's a good place to start if you really want to get into the microbiome and see what you're starting with. And I offer a free half-hour get to know you session just so we can really start to see if we can work together and work towards getting you feeling well and just your happy self, just finding your happy self. And one part of that will be to optimize your microbiome. So thank you if you've made it this far, and I hope to see you and your microbes soon.